Today we're out here in Oregon taking a look at the Mercedes-Benz AMG GTC. The C at the end of the AMG GTC indicates that this has the wider body version of the GT platform. And this is exactly the kind of vehicle that Mercedes-Benz does extraordinarily well, a beautiful rear-wheel drive, long-hooded coupe. Up front we have full LED headlamps, as you'd expect in a vehicle like this, with a light pipe right there inside. We have a single LED module right here for the low beams, and then 3 LED modules below for the high beams. As you can see, we have the turn signal on over there. That's an LED as well. We have a very large Mercedes logo right here in the center with sort of some vertical slashes right there, an AMG badge, well-integrated parking sensors, and a whole lot of extra cooling. Depending on the version of the GT that you get, you'll find one of 2 different tunes of 4-liter V8 engine. Both of them are twin turbocharged. One produces 469 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque. But if that's not enough oomph for you, you can pay for the 550 horsepower version, which is what we're driving right here. That bumps the torque up from 465 to 502. Power is sent to the rear wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that is fairly unique to this vehicle. In order to help save weight, we don't find a standard lead-acid 12-volt battery under here. Instead, we actually have a brand new lithium-ion battery. If there's one body style that Mercedes really knows how to design, it's the 2-door Roadster. At 179 inches long, this is only 1 to 2 inches longer than a Porsche 911, although the proportions of the vehicle make this look like it's extraordinarily long. We have this huge hood up front, a relatively small passenger area, and then a fairly discreet trunk out back. This is notably shorter than something like the Lexus LC500, which Lexus claims competes with the GTC, but I think that they're in kind of a different category. The profile out back is somewhat rounded off. We have a lot of functional vents going on down here around the rear end, twin exhaust as you'd expect. But the one thing that I do have to mention that I dislike is this twin bump arrangement on either side of the license plate. I would have preferred if they'd just left us the European cutout for the license plate. We are of course driving the convertible, so we have a fabric top that pops up out of a separate compartment than the trunk. Front seat comfort is excellent. I actually find these seats to be more comfortable for my body shape than the average 911 out there. We do have a multi-way adjustable driver's seat with a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable bolsters, and in kind of an unusual move, the seat controls are actually on the seat itself. This is something that we don't frequently see from Mercedes. Usually they're right over here on the door. It's kind of an odd move actually, because the sill is so close to the seat that this is actually the kind of vehicle where it would be more convenient to put the controls on the door. We have a power tilt telescopic steering column that is memory linked to the driver's seat, but the memory buttons are also on the seat down here, not on the door. Obviously, since this is a 2-door Roadster, there are just 2 seats up front. The passenger seat moves in the same motion as the driver, and there's nothing right behind me. Taking a quick spin around the interior, behind the driver and front passenger, we have a small plastic windbreaker right there. And then this black section right here is part of the parking sense system in Mercedes models. As we see in most Mercedes vehicles, as you get closer to an object, in addition to beeping, lights will actually light up on this bar, and then you look at that bar through the rearview mirror. The driver and front passenger get fixed height headrests, and the small vent you see right there in the headrest is part of the Mercedes air scarf system. Basically, this blows warm air out at your neck to help you feel a little bit warmer even on cold nights. You can see from this angle that the seats are very aggressively bolstered. The center section is perforated because these seats are both heated and ventilated. As you'd expect out of a high-end luxury car, we have a lot of stitched leather and other stitched materials going on the front door. There's a very small door pocket right at the bottom of the door, and then a carbon fiber trim strip right there along the armrest. Moving over to the dashboard, we find more stitched leather going on with this contrasting brown stitching up here, and then brown leather lower on the instrument panel. In the middle of the instrument panel, we find the Mercedes Command Infotainment screen, and then 4 large round air vents. The air vents move side to side and up and down, and this knob closes off the air vents in pairs. So this controls these 2 air vents, and this knob controls those 2 air vents. Below that, we find a button bank that should be fairly familiar to most Mercedes owners. This is where we find the heated seat controls, ventilated seat controls, the controls for the air scarf, a button to retract and deploy the spoiler out back, parking sense enable disable, and of course a hazard light button. Below that, we find the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control. There's also a menu button to take you over to the climate controls inside the command system. And then we have a roller cover over 2 very large cup holders. Although large takeout drinks may block access to the climate controls, it appears that these are set far enough back that they won't actually bash these buttons. Behind the cup holders, we find another array of buttons. Let's take a look at these one at a time. Over here on the left side, we find the drive mode controller. This allows us to choose between Comfort, Sport, Sport Plus, the individual mode, and of course, a race mode. Then we have an engine start-stop button. a button to enable and disable the traction control system, and then we have a button to adjust the suspension. You can choose between Sport, Sport Plus, and Comfort. On the right side of the center console, we find a button to turn on and off the Mercedes infotainment system, volume knob right there, a button for the manual mode on the transmission. We can enable and disable the start-stop system with that button, and open and close the active valves in the exhaust using that button. Then in the middle of everything, we have the Mercedes command controller. There's a back button, a favorite button. This button toggles side to side, up and down, rotates around, and clicks to enter. And then we have a touch controller for the same infotainment system. You can use either the touch controller to navigate the system or the command knob in front of it. We have a duplicate back button, forward button, and of course that favorite button right over there as well. Behind that we find the joystick style controller for the transmission. We toggle once for neutral, all the way back for drive, and then all the way forward for reverse. If you want to park the car, we hit the P button right there. Mercedes tends to prefer physical dials for their instrument cluster, so that's what we see over here on the driver's side. I have the car off right now, and so that's why we see all these warning lights indicated. It's not like something went wrong with the car. On the left side, we have an LED gauge for the fuel level, as well as the speedometer, and on the right, we have the tachometer and an LED gauge for the engine temperature. In the middle of everything, we have a color multifunction display. This is the same basic display design that we see in a wide variety of different Mercedes models. It gives us access to our trip computer information, as well as navigation turn-by-turn directions, radio and media readouts, telephone readouts, safety system readouts. You can also adjust certain vehicle settings right here in this display, and of course the AMG readouts like boost pressure, oil temperature, etc. The steering wheel is an Alcantara-wrapped 3-spoke design with the flat bottom and aggressive sport grips on the side. You'll find paddle shifters attached to the steering wheel that rotate with the wheel instead of being part of the steering column. We have down on the left and up over here on the right. On the right side of the steering wheel, we also find volume up, down, mute, phone buttons, a voice command button over here, voice command off, and then the rest of the buttons control that multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. Before we take the GT out on the road, let's talk a little bit about its design. The most important thing to remember about the GT is that this is the Mercedes-Benz vehicle that they're targeting very directly at things like the Nissan GT-R or the Porsche 911. This is not one of Mercedes' Grand Touring coupes like the Mercedes-Benz S-Class coupe, so it has a very different kind of mission and a very different kind of driving dynamic. The body of the GT is almost entirely aluminum, but there are also a decent number of magnesium and carbon fiber parts because ultra-lightweight construction was an important mission of the GT. And that's how Mercedes was able to give this vehicle a curb weight just over 3,600 pounds. That's about 1,000 pounds lighter than a BMW M6 and about 600 pounds lighter than a Mercedes-Benz C63 AMG coupe. The GT is quite light. There are a number of other unique features about the GT. For instance, we have 4-corner double wishbone suspension with active dampers and rear wheel steering in the model that we're driving. The other thing that's interesting about the GT is that it has a very slight rear weight bias. That means we have just a little bit more weight on the rear tires than on the front tires. That helps improve traction, and it also helps improve steering feel. But we don't see a significant rear weight bias like we see in a Porsche 911. The GT is still a front-engine, rear-wheel drive vehicle, but the way Mercedes got this weight balance is a little bit interesting. Because if you look at the side profile of the GT, it looks like there's enough room under this hood for an inline 8-cylinder engine or a very large V12, but we actually have a 4-liter V8, and that 4-liter V8 is jammed all the way behind the front tires. In order to make that possible, Mercedes moved the transmission to basically where the trunk would normally be located. And that's why in the GT we get a fairly shallow cargo area, because under that cargo area lives the 7-speed dual-clutch transaxle. They actually put the transmission and the rear axle all inside the same case. A front-engine rear transmissioned vehicle is not something that we see all that often, but it does happen now and then. And this reminds me for some reason of the Plymouth Prowler, which also had its engine up front and the transmission in the back, and similarly it also had a fairly small cargo area as a result, although we do find a bigger cargo area than you'll find in the 911. While we're talking about the engine, it's important to note that this engine produces a massive amount of torque over a very broad RPM range. You'll be producing hundreds of pound-feet of torque just off idle. By the time you hit 1900 RPM, you'll already be producing over 500 pound-feet of torque, and unlike some turbocharged engines, the torque does not suddenly drop off a cliff after a few thousand RPMs. It goes strong all the way until about 6,000 RPM when it does start to reduce. This is a very, very broad torque curve, and it makes the GT feel very different than something like a Nissan GT-R. The engine in the Nissan GT-R doesn't really get up and running until higher RPMs, and that's why it's really important to use launch control in the GT-R to get the fastest 0 to 60 acceleration time. If you don't use launch control in that Nissan, you just put your foot flat on the floor, it's sort of a wait for it, and then oh my god, we're accelerating. Thanks to the broad torque curve and a very low first gear, that's not what we get in the Mercedes. You get pretty much instant acceleration regardless of the mode that you're in. Now that we've covered all that, let's take it for a spin. The C version of the AMG GT goes from 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds. That is incredibly fast. That's actually faster than the Hellcat that we have also been driving today back to back with this. It's all about control. The Mercedes-Benz is much better able to control the power going to the rear axle, and we get a 9-speed automatic transmission with a slightly more aggressive first gear. The AMG GT was targeted directly at the Porsche 911, and it's very obvious when you get behind the wheel. This feels a little bit like a Porsche in terms of the overall seating position, overall dashboard position, etc. However, this is actually more comfortable than the last 911 that I was in. But the GTC also has a different driving dynamic than the Porsche 911, because the 911 has a solid rear weight bias because the engine is of course in the back, making the rear of the vehicle heavier than the front of the vehicle, and in the GTC it's the other way around. This has a more traditional front engine rear drive layout. And that means this is going to be a little bit more predictable when it comes to overall handling behavior. It also means that AMG was able to make this a rear-wheel drive vehicle, not an all-wheel drive vehicle. The all-wheel drive system in the 911 is there not just to give the 911 improved traction and improved acceleration, but also to help compensate for the fact that the weight is in the rear and the driving dynamic is something that's a little bit more challenging for the average driver to handle. A lot of racing professionals seem to prefer a vehicle that's lighter up front and heavier in the back, but in the hands of the average daily driver, it is going to be more challenging than what we see in the GTC. When it comes to handling, the GTC is absolutely incredible. This is one of the best handling vehicles that we've driven today. And that should come as no surprise, obviously, with a vehicle that's targeting something as iconic as the Porsche 911. In pursuit of that handling excellence, the ride definitely takes a toll. We're currently in the softest suspension mode, and you can definitely feel all the road imperfections out here on this winding road. The ride quality in the GTC surprised me just a little bit, because this is the kind of Mercedes that you might expect to have a relatively softer ride, something more like a GT. But remember that Mercedes has a wide variety of different sedans, coupes, and convertibles to choose from. So if you want something that's big, expensive, fast, and luxurious, then Mercedes would love to sell you an S-Class coupe. And that sort of leaves the GTC free to pursue a different mission, again targeting that Porsche shopper. And that's why everything about the GTC is raw and visceral, from the suspension tuning, to the throttle mapping, to the sound that comes out of the back when we start downshifting this transmission manually. This has an absolutely incredible exhaust note for a turbocharged engine. This doesn't sound quite as good as some of the naturally aspirated engines that are out there, or perhaps some of the supercharged engines, but this has one of the best turbocharged exhaust notes you can buy. And of course, that excellent exhaust note is attached to a vehicle that's fun to drive. We get a little bit more steering feedback than we find in the average entry in this category, and it's just overall more entertaining to drive than something like the Lexus LC500. Again, as I said earlier, Lexus thinks the LC500 competes with this, but I don't think that's a realistic comparison, especially when you drive this and the LC back to back. When it comes to creature comforts like cabin noise, this is a little bit louder inside the cabin than something like the Lexus LC, but you'd expect that with a vehicle that has a more dynamic mission in mind than that Lexus. The Lexus really is more of a GT-style cruiser. It's probably better targeted at someone that is looking at a Mercedes-Benz S-Class coupe but doesn't want to spend that kind of money. As you'd expect from a high-performance vehicle with a powerful engine under the hood, fuel economy has been a little on the low side. We've been averaging about 12 miles per gallon today. Keep in mind, we have been driving this car pretty hard, but you're definitely going to get better fuel economy in lower performance vehicles. This is not particularly unusual for vehicles that produce this kind of horsepower, however. If you're comparing this to pretty much any other 500 horsepower car out there, you're really going to end up in the low teens if you start driving the car hard. The GTC is unquestionably a hoot and a half to drive, but this isn't really the best daily driver, very much like certain 911 models, because the suspension really is very hard. And again, I have been driving in the most comfortable mode. If we dial this on up to Race or Sport Plus, the suspension really gets rock hard, and you can feel practically every pebble out on the road. Of course, when you put this in race mode, it becomes an awful lot more fun, and the exhaust pops and burbles just become that next level of entertaining. If you want to get your hands on a GT, you can spend $124,000, and that will get you the regular GT that goes from 0 to 60 around 3.8, 3.9 seconds. But if you want this GT, which is the GTC, it will set you back $157,000 before you start adding options, of course. As with many Mercedes models, expect to spend a great deal more if you get carried away with options. The model we've been driving today rang in right at $180,000. That may sound pretty expensive, but when you compare this to its target market, which is the 911 shopper, it makes complete sense. Because the GTC is right in there with the 911 GTS and, of course, the 911 Turbo. Versus the 911 Turbo, this is just about the same 0 to 60 time, but it's actually notably less expensive. And of course, the Audi R8 over the years has become considerably more expensive as well, so you can expect to spend $162 to $175 starting for the R8, which makes $157 for this sound like a pretty good deal. Of course, the GTC is a little too hardcore for my tastes. The suspension is just a little bit too firm, but again, it is targeting the 911 or R8 shopper. I suspect that if I had this kind of cash to spend on a Mercedes, I would probably buy the S-Class Coupe. And I know that sounds like sacrilege to people that are looking for a sporty two-door roadster, but I think I'm after something just a little bit softer. Be sure and let me know what you think about the GTC down there in the comment section below. Be sure and check out our recent review of the LC500 Coupe as well, which Lexus thinks competes with the GT, but in all honesty, it really doesn't compete with especially this GTC at all. You can also head over to facebook.com/AlexNautos to see what I'm driving right now, and of course, I'll see you next week.